Welcome everyone here tonight. On behalf of Radboud Reflects, the tijdschrift voor theologie, the Edward Schillebeeckx Foundation and the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology and Religion Studies, I welcome you very much to what is already the fourth Edward Schillebeeckx lecture. This lecture is held in the memory of Nijmegen's most famous theologian. And each time we invite inspiring thinkers who work along the same lines as he did to give a public lecture. And because Schillebeeckx was very well known, and quite ahead of his time too, for his openness, interest and respect for other religions as well as non-believers, we have chosen this to be the topic of tonight's lecture. And should that alone not be enough for a wonderful evening, we also celebrate the 95th anniversary of Radboud University, and in particular that of the Faculty of Theology, because that was one of the three founding fathers. My name is Liesbeth Jansen. I am a program manager for Radboud Reflects. And I would like now to give the floor to Erik Borgman, theologian at Tilburg University, chief editor of Tijdschrift voor Theologie, that was actually founded by Edward Schillebeeckx, chairman of the Edward Schillebeeckx Foundation, and a lay Dominican. There's a lot more to say about Erik Borgman alone, but I think I have said enough for now. So I will give the floor to Erik to introduce tonight's speaker, Catherine Cornille. Erik.
Yes, well, good evening and a very welcome to you all. On this, as Liesbeth already said, this fourth Edward Schillebeeckx lecture, an initiative from the Tijdschrift voor Theologie and the Stichting Edward Schillebeeckx, the Edward Schillebeeckx Foundation, sponsored and co-organized by the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology and Religious Studies, Radboud Reflects, and also sponsored by the Dutch Dominicans. As you may know, I am not Stefan van Erp, who was originally supposed to present this evening, but Stefan is still in Bologna for a meeting and I have the honor to stand in for him tonight. At former Edward Schillebeeckx lectures, we had distinguished guests already. As you might remember, Timothy Radcliffe, Rowan Williams, Terry Eagleton, and tonight I have the privilege to welcome Catherine Cornille. As it's not so generally known, Edward Schillebeeckx pioneered in the plea for what we now call interreligious dialogue already in the second half of the 1970s in his book that in Dutch is entitled Gerechtigheid en Liefde, Genade en Bevrijding, and that in the English is called Christ, the Christian Experience in the Modern World, or Christ, the Experience of Jesus as Lord. The one is the English and the other is the US edition. Schillebeeckx stated that Jesus did not fully reveal all the truth that is to be known about God, and that we therefore need to learn from other religions. So tonight we have a world-renowned expert on the interreligious dialogue, Catherine Cornille, originally, like Edward Schillebeeckx, from Flanders, a student of Leuven, but now in Boston in the US. A very welcome to you, warm welcome to you, Catherine. First, let me spell out a little bit of the schedule of this evening. Catherine will speak approximately 45 minutes, and then she and I will have a half an hour of conversation in these lounge chairs, so it will be a lounging conversation, as you all will understand. And then after that there will be a quarter of an hour for questions from you, the audience, and of course answers from Catherine. And in the end we will say something about the other event that we celebrate today, because together with the Edward Schillebeeckx lecture we have an Edward Schillebeeckx essay prize, and there is something to say about that as well at the end of this meeting. But first, let me properly introduce Catherine Cornille. She is a professor of comparative theology and specializes in theology of religion and interreligious dialogue. She presently holds the Newton College Alumni Chair of Western Culture. Yes, that's what they do in the United States, these kind of names, in the Department of Theology in Boston College. Catherine Cornille is born in Flanders. She took a BA at the KU Leuven, an MA at the University of Hawaii, and then a PhD again in Leuven in 1989. And she's in Boston now since 2005, if I'm correctly informed. Among her books is a monograph on the impossibility of the interreligious dialogue, published in 2008, and an edited volume on Christian communities, Christian commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita in 2007, and another edited volume on multiple religious belonging and Christian identity, entitled Many Mentions, published in 2010. She is also the editor of the Willie Blackwell Companion to Interreligious Dialogue, published in 2013. The title of her lecture tonight is In Pursuit of Humility, the Possibility and Promise of Interreligious Dialogue. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. This is really an incredible honor for me to be here in the first place. I didn't quite feel worthy to be in the lineup of the previous theologians who have given this lecture. But I was able to meet, I had the fortune to meet Schillebeeckx only once or twice in my life, and I remember how incredibly impressed I was with his own personal humility for somebody of that stature. So I thought this would be an appropriate topic for this evening. Some of you may have come to hear the topic of the impossibility of interreligious dialogue, which is the title that I had originally given for this talk. So I want to maybe first start with a few words about that before I segue into the topic of humility. So the impossibility of interreligious dialogue was really, my reflection on that was really the occasion also for me originally to think about questions of humility, and in particular about theological or epistemological humility in interreligious dialogue. So one of the main obstacles for any constructive dialogue between religions is the fact that every religion believes that it is the only, the highest, the supreme truth, and that no other religion has anything to say or to offer to one's own tradition. So this kind of theological absolutism is in some way very natural for religious traditions, because it's through this kind of conviction and recognition that one's own religion has the fullness of truth that one will develop a kind of complete dedication and submission of one's own will to that tradition. So the kind of theological absolutism goes together with what we call religious confidence in the truth and the validity of a particular religion to bring one to the highest good. So there is a logic for the absolutism of every religious tradition, but as you understand, it really doesn't go together with the kind of openness that is necessary for a dialogue between religions. So today what I would like to do is reflect a little bit more on the topic of humility and what religions can learn from each other, and I will focus here mainly on what Christianity can learn from other religions in regard to the topic of theological humility and spiritual humility. So my talk will really focus on those two rather distinct meanings of humility that are somewhat interrelated. You will see, hopefully, as I go along, how they do connect with each other, but they are also different in terms of the way in which I propose Christianity can learn from other religious traditions. So, first, I want to say something about the topic of humility in general, because it's indeed one of the most unfashionable topics, I think, in our contemporary culture that is so oriented towards achievement and success and a sense of self-worth and dignity and so forth. The idea of humility seems to be very countercultural or unfashionable. And yet, I would argue that it is a quintessentially religious value, quintessentially religious, and that it is maybe the one thing that all religions have in common is the importance of humility, of personal humility, of spiritual humility. If we look at the various religious traditions, it's clear that every religious tradition identifies pride and arrogance as the origin of all evil and sin. You know, if we just think of the creation story, the origin of evil in the Genesis story has to do with pride and turning away from God and putting one's own will over the will of God. In Judaism in general, humble submission to the Torah is at the center of all of Jewish life. The Talmud also calls humility the chief virtue of all. Pride is a characteristic and most corrupting human offense. So there we already see also the emphasis on humility as a central religious virtue. In the Christian tradition, from the very beginning, you know, Augustine talked about humility as the sum total of the medicine required to heal us. The sum total of the medicine required to heal us. Anthony of the Desert spoke about humility as the first of all virtues. Gregory the Great, this is a quote from him, "Great, my brethren, great is a sublime virtue of humility, which can reach what none can teach, worthy to obtain what none can explain, worthy to conceive by the word and of the word that which it cannot set forth in its own words." If we look at the monastic tradition in Christianity from the beginning, Saint Benedict talks about the ascent to God as an ascent through 12 steps of humility. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux turns that around and talks about how the soul gets entangled in pride through the 12 steps of humility and pride. Ignatius of Loyola, Teresa of Avila, Thomas Aquinas, up to the present day, Simone Weil, Jean-Louis Chrétien, they all talk about the central importance of humility in Christian spiritual life. Christian de Chergé, the famous Trappist martyr, talks about humility as the climate in which he lives together with Muslims and in which they pray together. So humility also permeates the whole Christian tradition as the central virtue. In Islam, of course, the very term Islam means surrender. So humility, humble surrender to the revelation in the Quran itself and to the tradition is also central to Islam. In the Islamic spiritual tradition, in the Sufi tradition, there's also an ascent through various stages of closeness to God. And the highest stage is called fana, self-extinction or evaporation of the ego. Yes, so again, a recurrent theme of humility. Some say that humility is really a virtue that's typical for theistic traditions, that you can only be humble in relation to a personal God. And we can talk about that later, whether that's the case or not. But if we see humility as the opposite of pride, and pride as essentially connected to the ego, to an inflated self, then I would say the traditions of Asia have a very strong emphasis on humility, that they focus not in relationship to God, but in terms of the ultimate truth itself, is the state in Buddhism of no self, anatta or anatman. In Hinduism, the term atman is used, but I would argue that it's refers basically to the same idea as anatman, in the sense that it's the opposite of the ego. It's the opposite of everything that has to do with an independent and autonomous self. So all of that has to be given up in Hinduism and in Buddhism also to reach the highest state of realization. And the same goes, I can continue with Taoism and Confucianism, maybe somewhat less, but still in all of these traditions we see that pride, arrogance, autonomy is the cause of all evil, and humility, or its analog, its equivalent, is the cause of salvation. It's the means to the ultimate good, and it's the result of the ultimate good. So it's a very, very quintessentially religious virtue. It's what all, as I said, what all religions have in common. All religions also talk about the fruits of humility. So that highest state of humility leads to peace, freedom, joy, compassion, equanimity, detachment, love. In every religious tradition, it's quite remarkable that those are the fruits of that ultimate state of abandonment of oneself or humiliation of oneself in relationship to the divine. So if we recognize that humility is indeed a universal religious virtue, then I have two questions for us tonight. The first question is, if that's the case, if humility is indeed so central, why is it that religions don't naturally practice that doctrinal humility, theological humility, epistemological humility, however you want to call it? And how can religions learn something from one another in that regard? So that's my first question, because it's obvious that spiritual humility doesn't naturally lead to doctrinal humility. You know, if you just take the example of Bernard of Clairvaux, who is the master of humility in Christianity, he's also one of the great advocates of the Crusades. Yeah. So how do we reconcile spiritual humility and doctrinal humility? They don't necessarily go together. And I would argue that dialogue with other religions, and in particularly with Buddhism and Hinduism, can help Christianity recover its own sense of doctrinal humility. And that's the first thing I would like to demonstrate. The second thing is that I believe that the virtue of humility has come to be fundamentally misunderstood in the Christian tradition. It has come to be regarded as a moral virtue, as something that individuals experience or have to experience with regard to one another. It's often also regarded to be a typical feminine virtue. So it's been used and abused to maintain the hierarchical status quo, the patriarchal status quo, to keep people in their own status or position in society. And I believe that that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the virtue of humility. And again, I would argue, I will try to show how dialogue with Buddhism, for example, can lead Christianity, or can lead all of us and any believer, to a new understanding of what humility really means also in the Christian tradition. So those are the two things I would like to focus on this evening. So first, in terms of doctrinal humility, as Eric already pointed out, I think we can look at Schillebeeckx as certainly an important inspiration for Christianity in terms of developing a doctrinal humility. He certainly was one of the first in the Catholic tradition to recognize the fact that in the development of the Christian faith, he said, believers begin to catch a glimpse of significant new dimensions to their own Christian tradition, precisely as a result of the introduction of new stimuli from the outside, stimuli that were in fact alien to their religion. So here we see already a recognition that Christianity may not have the fullness of truth, and that Christianity may receive input and stimulation from the outside world. And of course, this is not only from other religious traditions, from science, from social developments, from political movements. That's of course the way theology has developed in the past 50 years throughout the world. But in addition to all of these other social elements, I would argue that the main stimuli for the development of Christian self-understanding has been the confrontation with other religious traditions. Other religious traditions that both form a challenge to Christian self-understanding, but also a tremendous potential for inspiration. And Schillebeeckx himself said the multiplicity of religions is not an evil which needs to be removed, but rather a wealth that is to be welcomed and enjoyed by all. So he was really one of the pioneers. I mean, many theologians since him have talked about religious pluralism, de facto and in re, whereas he really emphasized the fact that it was an essential good that Christianity could learn from. And as Eric already said, there's more religious truth in all the religions together than in any one particular religion. So Schillebeeckx himself, I think, would support this very much this idea of doctrinal humility. Another way in which Schillebeeckx has been important, I think, for recognition of humility in the Christian tradition is in his Christology, in his recognition that, as he put it, God has not revealed himself exclusively and exhaustively in Jesus Christ. So this move away from a kind of absoluteness of the incarnation was fairly radical and is still, in fact, quite controversial in Christian theology. But I think that is also something that, of course, has opened the door to learning from other religions if God is indeed not fully and not exhaustively revealed in Jesus Christ. So Schillebeeckx's emphasis on the contingent nature of Jesus Christ, I think, has been an inspiration for many theologians, has also caused a lot of controversy in Christian theology of religions, but I think has really opened the door to reflection more on what we can learn from other religious traditions. Now, as time has gone on, Christian theologians have become really experts in other religious traditions, and those who have focused on Hinduism and Buddhism have, in particular, learned from those traditions the importance of the Christian apophatic tradition, or recovered the importance of the Christian apophatic tradition. And this is one of the things I think that in interreligious dialogue is absolutely crucial, namely that other religions become the catalyst to recovering elements from your own tradition that may have been forgotten or neglected or sometimes made into a heresy for no good reason or for dubious reasons. And so dialogue with other religious traditions has often led to a recovery of those resources in one's own tradition that are underemphasized. And so what we see, it's quite remarkable in the dialogue with Buddhism and Hinduism, is that Christian theologians have really recovered the own apophatic tradition or the tradition of negative theology. And those elements are particularly strong in Hinduism and Buddhism. I don't know, in Hinduism, the distinction that is always made between Brahman with qualities and Brahman without qualities. So there is a kind of God that can be known, Saguna Brahman, and then there is the God beyond God, Nirguna Brahman, who cannot be known. From the beginning of the Hindu tradition in the Upanishads, it's always emphasized that the ultimate truth cannot be known. It is beyond our understanding. You can only approach it by negative terms. Neti, neti, not this, not that. So the idea that ultimate truth is radically transcendent or apophatic is absolutely at the core of the Hindu tradition. Then in the Buddhist tradition, the idea of the absolute emptiness shunyata, of reality, also emphasizes the impossibility of fully and finally expressing any absolute truth in concepts and words. So in Buddhism has the same emphasis on the absolute transcendence. There's a distinction there also between two truths: the conventional truth that can be spoken of in words and that has to be expressed in words, and then the ultimate truth that is absolutely beyond our understanding. And so these Christian theologians have, I will just quote a few of them in terms of how they understand the importance of these traditions for reimagining a kind of Christian theology that is more humble in its own self-understanding. So maybe you're familiar with the French Benedictine Henri Le Sceau. He went to India in the 50s already, so long before Vatican II, took the name Abhishektananda, immersed himself completely in Hindu spirituality and became a disciple of a Hindu spiritual teacher and studied really Advaita very, very deeply. And he says Advaita, so the idea of non-duality between God and the self, is not so much a challenge to Christian faith as a relentless reminder that God, and therefore also the acts of God, can never be wholly contained in our concepts. It is a healthy and permanently necessary reminder of the importance of, quote, the way of negation. It condemns and at the same time frees us from the idolatry of the intellect, in which our laziness and pride perpetually threaten to engulf us. So for him, more than anything else, what Advaita or the Hindu tradition does is purify Christianity from the tendency to theological and intellectual laziness, to identifying too much with our concepts and our categories and not recognizing the incompleteness or the inadequacy ultimately of ultimate truth. In the area of comparative theology, there's been a lot of Christian theologians who have engaged with Buddhism. I don't know if the names of Jan van Bracht, the Belgian Schut priest, or Jim Heisig, or John Keenan, or Joseph O'Leary are all Christian theologians who are very profoundly engaged with Buddhism, and they all push the same point, that what Buddhism does is it has a purgative effect on the literalizing of talk about God. That's how Jim Heisig, for example, puts it. John Keenan in his work also has through his study of Buddhism, has rediscovered, Pseudo-Dionysius, Meister Eckhart, again, the Christian theologians that emphasize negative theology as sort of a Buddhist or Christian inspiration. He argues that the Buddhist notion of the ultimate is in deep harmony with this apophatic tradition of Christian theology. Far from being contradictory to Christian concerns, its insistence on the otherness is indeed method for abandoning the anthropomorphic musings that Christians are fond of in their consequent entanglement in imaginary and debilitating constructs. Strong language, but you see what he's trying to say is that what Buddhism can do is free us from our entanglement in theological constructs that ultimately keep us from advancing in our own theological understanding. And then, comparative theologians are going further than that and adopting sometimes Buddhist concepts to rethink Christian theology. So a very sort of pioneering comparative theologian, Joseph O'Leary, for example, in many of his works has used the category of upaya. That's a Buddhist category that refers to all doctrine as, quote, skillful means. So doctrines are not absolute claims, but they are means to bring the devotee or the disciple to the experience of liberation, but they are not themselves absolute. They are skillful means. Now, when I say merely skillful means, that is not really the correct use of the term, because skillful means are also true. They're not merely So that doesn't, by using that category of skillful means to apply it to Christianity, doesn't mean that Christian doctrine is interchangeable with any other teaching, or that it is merely human concepts. No, there's a truth that is still given to their concepts, but they cannot be absolutized themselves. So, as O'Leary puts it, if we use that category of upaya or skillful means and apply that to Christian doctrine, we can approach Christian, or we can cherish, he says, the richness of the religious fabric while not investing too much in doctrinal fixations. Another thing he says is, what it allows us is to use doctrinal categories, quote, more lightly and adroitly, if we use that category of skillful means and use that to reinterpret or understand the place of doctrine anew in the Christian tradition. So you see, what this creates is a sort of space for Christian teaching to breathe and to be open to what other religions possibly also have to teach Christianity. And of course, it's in the nature of Christianity itself, in its eschatological orientation, to recognize that all doctrine, all categories are always provisional, that none of our categories are themselves the ultimate truth, that it's always, provisional, historical, contextual language that will only be fully understood at the end of time. So Christianity itself is, in fact, or within the Christian tradition itself, I think, with other theologians, that its eschatological orientation itself is the medicine for theological humility. It prevents us from absolutizing any doctrines or truth claims. And that's also what people like Jacques Dupuy says. He states, he states, perhaps nothing which provides interreligious dialogue with such deep theological basis and such true motivation as a conviction that in spite of the differences by which they are distinguished, the members of different religious traditions, co-members in the reign of God in history, are traveling together towards a new humanity willed by God for the end of time, of which they are called to be co-creators with God. Yeah, so the idea that the fullness of truth is always eschatological and will always reveal itself at the end of time gives us, I think, an immediate basis for doctrinal humility and for possible openness to other religious traditions. So those are, I think, a few resources that may help Christianity rediscover its own doctrinal humility. And that's then a basis for dialogue with other religious traditions on any topic, right? So not just on humility, but on any religious topic. But I would like to stay with the topic of humility itself and see whether, as Christians, we can come to a new understanding and a rehabilitation, as I would call it, of the virtue of humility in Christianity, and understand it anew, maybe again through the detour through Buddhism in particular. I would like to explore that possibility. So why is it that humility has such a bad reputation in society at large and also in Christianity? I mean, Nietzsche talked about humility, or Christian idea of humility, in terms of pusillanimity, sort of cowardly. It's a kind of cowardly virtue of timidity. And when we look at the way humility is described by Christian, the masters of humility, it's pretty depressing, in fact. So dealing with, I will just quote some. So Augustine states that, quote, humility is that thorough self-examination which makes man contemptible in his own sight. The anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing defines humility as, quote, a true knowledge and experience of yourself as you are, a wretch, filth, far worse than nothing. Thomas à Kempis states that, quote, "Nothing is so beneficial as true understanding of ourselves, which produces wholesome self-contempt. Always think kindly of others while holding yourself as nothing." You know, it's not very uplifting in terms of language, and as I said, rather countercultural in our contemporary environment where we're so enamored with the idea of success and prestige and self-worth and self-elevation. So it's not really surprising that the virtue of humility has such a bad reputation. However, if it is really the most profound of virtues, there has to be a way of understanding it and also of living it that is somewhat more inspiring or uplifting. And so I think that the Buddhist equivalent to humility may help us understand humility in a new way. As I said in the beginning, the problem with humility is that it's become a moral virtue. So we're taught to be humble towards each other, never to aspire to more than what we have been given in life, and so on. So it's been seen as a kind of virtue that keeps people down and not really, and doesn't allow them to excel, or that keeps women in their place. So it's come to be seen as a kind of way for society to maintain a status quo, but that's not at all what the virtue of humility meant originally. So humility in the Christian tradition is a profoundly spiritual virtue. So it's not at all a moral virtue. It's a spiritual or an ontological or an existential virtue. It has nothing or very little to do with interpersonal relationships and everything to do with a true self-understanding or true knowledge of who we are in relationship to God. And in fact, humility, as most Christian spiritual writers talk about it, humility is a form of divinization. Through self-humiliation, we become one with God. So it's not at all a matter of holding us down. It's, on the other hand, a matter of elevating us to be one with God, or to become in union with God. So in that sense, it's a profoundly spiritual virtue. And I think the Buddhist notion of anatman or anatta is something that can help us rethink the virtue of humility as a spiritual virtue and an existential virtue rather than a moral virtue. Because anatta or anatman in the Buddhist tradition has everything to do with our true self. And our true self is defined in the Buddhist tradition in terms of impermanence of any idea of I or self. So the idea of the impermanence of the self is what is ultimately the truth of any individual. So there is no permanent I that continues from moment to moment and that can be the source of pride. So what Buddhism does is it undercuts humility by reasoning oneself back to who am I really? So it undercuts the very basis of humility through an understanding of one's true nature, which is impermanent and constantly changing. And it's understanding or knowledge of the impermanence of the self that allows one to be free from pride. So the Dalai Lama, for example, when he talks about humility, he says humility is attained through meditation on the skandhas. The skandhas are the constituent elements that together form the ego or the I. The skandhas are form, perception, feeling, consciousness, and will. Those 5 elements are, in the Buddhist anthropology, continuously reconfigured to form the illusion of a permanent and unchanging I. But they themselves are constantly changing. So there is no I to be proud in the Buddhist tradition. And so it's really knowledge or understanding of that reality that frees one from attachment to the ego and from behavior based on pride and the ego. So I think if going through Buddhism and coming back to Christianity, we can come to a deeper realization indeed of the fact that humility is not a moral virtue, but is an existential reality. And I would even say, if we can understand humility as the state of no self in relationship to God, I think that sounds a bit cooler, if you will, in the contemporary climate and culture than the traditional virtue of humility. So maybe we need a different word for humility. Maybe the term itself has been so contaminated that it's very difficult to conceive of what it really means in epistemological or in ontological terms. But I thought the idea of no self in relationship to God is probably a helpful way of understanding humility and what it ultimately leads to. As I said before, a humility, and I mean, Christian authors also talk about it ultimately as an ontological virtue. So Jean-Louis Chrétien, for example, says humility is the distinctively Christian and thus paradoxical response to the injunction, know thyself. Bernard also talked about pride or love of your own excellence dims the mind and overshadows the truth in such a way that you no longer see yourself as you are actually or potentially, but you either fancy that you are or hope you will be such as you would love to be. So you see, I mean, these authors also don't talk about humility in any moral sense. It's always in relationship to God. And by, as I said, attaining humility, we rise to becoming one with God. Meister Eckhart has a beautiful image of mountains and valleys. He says the highest heights of exaltation lie precisely in the lowest depths of humiliation. For the deeper the valleys go, the loftier the heights that rise above them. The deeper the well, the higher too. For depth and height are the same thing. So, I think it's a constant in the Christian tradition that humiliation leads to exaltation, and that is really what that virtue of humility really is about. We become the image and the instrument of God through the practice of humility. Finally, I think Buddhism, another thing that Buddhism can do for Christianity is provide some means to realize that state of humility. I think Buddhism and Hinduism also, but more than any tradition, has developed a very subtle and very sophisticated understanding of the human mind and how the experience of pride arises and how it's cultivated and perpetuated and so forth. And all of the techniques of Buddhism, whether it's Zen Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism or Tendai Buddhism, all of the practices of meditation in the Buddhist tradition are all geared towards uprooting the sense of ego and pride, and uprooting it by not so much accusing somebody of pride, but by trying to go back to the root of it and undercutting the root of pride so that the experience of humility may be, or no self may be attained. So I think, when we look at society today, even though the virtue of humility is so out-fashioned, Buddhist practices are very popular and people flock to them in many Buddhist traditions. And nobody would ever admit that what they're looking for would be humility, of course. But they are looking for equanimity, they are looking for peace, for tranquility, for love, for wholeness, all of these qualities that are precisely the fruit of humility in Christianity. So I think that's sort of also evidence that what Buddhism has to offer may be something that Christianity can learn something from. And I'm talking particularly in the techniques of cultivating humility, that epistemological humility. I don't have time to go into those details. Now, I want to make clear that I'm not arguing that Buddhism and Christianity are the same, or that they are ultimately leading to the same goal, or that the practice of humility in Christianity and anatta are ultimately the same. Christian humility, one of the beauties, I think, of Christian humility is the fact that it's always regarded as a gift and not something that we can attain by our own efforts. So it's always regarded as a gift from God, ultimately. And another very special teaching of Christianity with regard to humility is the idea that only Christ is fully humble. Only Christ is fully humble. And that, I think, indeed saves us from an arrogant pretense to paradoxically be humble, because we can never attain that ultimate state of humility that is only in the person of Jesus Christ. So I think these are two very distinct characteristics of humility, humility as gift, and the idea that only Christ is fully humble are two elements that are quite distinctive of Christian humility. It's the ultimate state of humility that Bernard of Clairvaux also talks about in relationship to God. Is the idea of humility when it's in relation, different from the experience of no self. This is sort of one of the perennial and unanswerable questions that have to do with the unity or diversity of mystical experiences. But I will just read to you what Bernard of Clairvaux says about that ultimate state of total humility. He says, there he sees invisible things and hears unspeakable words, which it is not given to man to utter. They are beyond the knowledge which night can pass unto night, for this is the word that day utters to day. And in another passage he says, finally they are carried up to the hidden home of truth itself, and there they say, my secret to myself, my secret to myself. So these words, again, point to, I think, the ineffability of the experience of total humility, of becoming one with God. And that's, I think, where there is a connection with the idea of doctrinal humility. In becoming completely humble, we get a first-hand experience of the radical ineffability or unspeakability, inadequacy of our words to express the ultimate reality. And that then, in turn, reinforces, I think, doctrinal humility. And maybe that also explains why it's the dialogue between monks in different religious traditions that has gone so effortlessly, it seems. So monastics in different religious traditions have been really pioneers in interreligious dialogue. And, I'm not going to make any big statements about that, but it is quite remarkable that they recognize maybe in each other's experience of radical no self or radical humility something that is common to the two traditions. But I think, what Buddhism can also do is bring the idea of humility outside of a strictly monastic context. In the Christian tradition, the steps of humility and pride have all been cultivated in monasteries, and what Buddhism offers is a way to open up the kind of path to humility, I think, to the broader public, and show ways in which lay people can also practice humility and enjoy the fruits of humility. So I've hopefully, with this, I hope I have given you sort of a small taste of what the fruits can be, of the possibility and the fruits of interreligious dialogue. Of course, it's an enormous topic in itself, both doctrinal humility and spiritual humility. but certainly what I personally believe and what everybody is practicing in the field of comparative theology is based on the belief that it is indeed possible to engage in a constructive dialogue with other religious traditions, and that each religion can evolve and learn through that dialogue with others. So I look forward now to my conversation with Eric, and thank you for listening.
Of course, we have to bring the time, because otherwise we can be humble, but we are lost anyway. Then, so it's good to at least to have the discipline of the clock. I was struck by your idea that it would be possible to make humility cool again. It is a very interesting concept. Somebody from the disciplines of communication can do some study of that. I think how to make humility cool again. I really thought that it was a very profound lecture on what humility really is, and I was struck by the levels. You did it more or less, or at least seemingly offhand, but you used a very different levels of what humility is. I mean, first of all, of course, in interreligious dialogue, humility simply is, I have to be able to listen to you, and if I think I know everything, why would I listen to you? So that's humility in a very normal sense of the word. But then you move on to the idea of humility of a whole tradition, and then of course to almost an ontological aspect of being human is and the insight in that. And in the end, you even suggest that God, or at least Christ, might be in his way humble, and then of course the whole thing of humble and exaltation will more or less twist. Could you say something more about these levels and how they are connected? I mean, do you think that, for instance, the whole starting point, being humble enough to learn from other traditions, has something to do with this ultimate humility that you're talking about? Could you say something more on that issue?
Yeah, so it's only through that ultimate humility that religions can learn something from, not just about other religions. Yeah. So learning about other religions, of course, requires just a basic intellectual humility that we don't know everything, and other religions are very complex and diverse, and we have to engage in a profound study of the other religion in order to learn about it. But in order to learn from it, that's where the idea of doctrinal humility is necessary, and where I have tried to find resources within the Christian tradition in order to make that possible. And every tradition, of course, has to do that for itself. So I would say that type of doctrinal theological humility is necessary for every religious tradition. In Christianity, we try to find it in eschatological anticipation, or in our apophatic tradition, or in our historical consciousness, and so forth. But every religious tradition has to find it somewhere in its own sources, and maybe some traditions have more capacity for that humility than others. We also have to look at that sometimes in the dialogue with religions. But yeah, so theological humility is precisely what is necessary for dialogue, and for the possibility of dialogue on spiritual humility also.
Yes, okay, thank you. But I would like to push it a little further, because when you try to explain it in this way, you're almost suggesting that you first have to be part of a religious tradition already to be able to understand what other religious traditions are saying, and then humility is always part of, at least also part of your own tradition. How do you see that? Is interreligious dialogue only possible when you are from a certain tradition and then become more or less dissatisfied with it, or say, well, there should be more? Or how is this relation? Is it possible to be non-religious or at least outside of any tradition, and then do something with interreligious dialogue?
Yeah. So this is a very hot button, and when you push this one, I can go on for quite a while. But I would say that if you're not part of a religious tradition, I don't think the idea of doctrinal humility is a problem, because you're not part of a tradition that claims to have the absolute truth. So in some sense, it's easier because you're not burdened by the claims of a particular tradition. On the other hand, there's also something problematic in terms of interreligious dialogue. So I think if we talk about interreligious dialogue, we're talking about dialogue between religions or religious traditions that have their challenges and their obstacles, and that have to be dealt with in order to move forward. But still, the fruits of those kinds of dialogues then can be brought back to a tradition and be used by a broader religious tradition. If we talk about interreligious dialogue as a purely personal experience, it may be easier to enter into dialogue. And we see, the idea of, in the period of New Age or now religious hybridity, people pick and choose from different religious traditions in an attitude maybe of personal humility in terms of learning from other religious traditions. But there's something, I think, missing in terms of a religious humility towards a kind of absoluteness that is given. So what is happening in this type of interreligious dialogue that's done on a purely personal basis is that the individual then becomes the measure of what is true and valuable in other religious tradition. And the question is, who does the individual submit him or herself to? What is the humility of the individual? You can say, well, the individual submits him or herself to the absolute in a very broad sense of the term, but humility also has to be practiced in relation to, hence, the monastic discipline of obedience and service and submitting oneself, one's will to the superior, and so forth. All of those things are important to experience that ultimate humility, and I just wonder how that is possible in a system where there is no tradition within which one becomes humbled.
Yeah. Could you endorse the phrase that you need to know that there is some religious truth to be able to seek for it and to be humble, humble enough not to know it? I mean, this, of course, the paradox of the whole matter, because it's only serious when you know that you depend on it. But on the other hand, if you really know that you depend on it, it's very disturbing that you don't know where you're depending on. So is that something of what for you the issue is? I mean, why it is a religious practice, where interreligious dialogue is a religious practice as well, and not just a cultural thing or something like that?
Yeah, and I don't want to be too dismissive of the kind of dialogue that happens on an individual basis, that isn't grounded in a particular religious tradition. It can be very sophisticated and very interesting, but what it misses, I think, is the aspect of otherness, the otherness that to which one submits oneself.
Yeah.
So the idea of heteronomy that's so essential to religion, I think, is just not present. And I would say this situation in which any individual combines elements from different religious traditions just creates different cells of individuals practicing different things, and then the very idea of a tradition disappears.
Yes.
I think.
Yeah. On a little different note, but more or less on the same issue, you were quoting a number of things from especially the Buddhist and Hinduist and Buddhist tradition, of more or less like the idea of, and of course, ultimately we cannot speak or know or talk about what God really is. God is beyond words, etc., etc., etc. And I have to admit, I always become a little nervous because of that kind things. Not necessarily because then I see my own. My own job disappear. I mean, what is there if we cannot talk about it anymore? But it's when you really think that our language doesn't tell you much of anything about the divine. Well, there is no reason, but ultimately no way of being in dialogue, because everything more or less is the same, or we don't know what the difference is. So that is so for me there is something which is also has a Christian aspect. I mean, the whole idea of incarnation is there, and how serious do you then take our histories and the language that's of course always connected with histories, but also the more principal understanding. How could you combine that idea with the necessity to dialogue? I mean, because then there is nothing to dialogue. You can simply say, okay, if that's what you think, probably just as far from the divine as I am. So but how do you deal with that kind of?
So that's the question of the difference between relativism and relativity, I would say.
Yeah.
So you can understand, or you can realize the relativity of your language without falling into relativism. And the way to understand it, and in fact, even Hinduism and Buddhism don't think that all language is equally true or interchangeable. The idea of two truths in Buddhism is based on the idea that conventional truth is arguable. If you look at the whole history of Tibetan Buddhism, it's a whole history of theological and Buddhological argumentation between different schools on which one which one uses language that is more adequate. Yeah. So if language was absolutely indifferent, then they wouldn't argue about it. Yeah. So certainly in any religious tradition, language is absolutely important and is reflective of truth. And the transcendence is always transcendent of something in particular. So I don't think you have to emphasize the relativism of what you believe. It's God is transcendent in relation to what we already believe and what we believe to be true, but it's still beyond that. So we want to discover more about that truth on the basis of what we already know.
Yeah.
So in interreligious dialogue, that's another element I think that's important to emphasize. Is interreligious dialogue is not just sort of based on sometimes it's based on a sort of common denominator, but usually you enter into dialogue with another tradition on topics that are relevant for your own, and on the basis of the normativity of your own tradition. So when I, as a Christian, enter into dialogue with Buddhism, I will not recognize as valuable or true anything that is in contradiction with Christianity. So I will only recognize as valuable and true things that are in continuity, in complementarity with Christianity. So I think recognizing the inadequacy, the ultimate inadequacy of religious language doesn't mean emphasizing the absolute relativity and interchangeability of all language. And in comparative theology also, I always argue that apologetics ought to be also part of comparative theology. We ought to be able and to continue to argue for the truth, sometimes even the superior truth of our own tradition in relationship to others. So I certainly, with the idea of doctrinal humility, certainly want to steer very far away from a kind of doctrinal relativism that may be part of a kind of pluralism, a pluralistic approach to religious diversity, but that I don't find particularly helpful theologically.
Yeah, but that is very much a part of our culture. So that's, of course, why I teach you how to say a little bit more on that, because I think this is one of the problems with, at least from my point of view, with interreligious dialogue, and not so much the dialogue in itself, but the whole idea that this ultimately means that no religion is true anyway. So, and then of course you lose the whole debate, because then nothing is important again anymore, which is, I think, related to something you're refer to almost in passing in your lecture, but of course, in at least the Catholic tradition, the whole connection with interreligious dialogue didn't come directly through the idea, oh, we have to debate the other religions. It came, at least for people like Schillebeeckx, from the idea that we have to learn not only from our own tradition from within, but also that some things are coming to us and that could be, had something to say to our tradition. And part of that is history. I mean, what history is telling us, other philosophers, even atheism. I mean, that's of course one of the main things of Vatican II, that they even thought that atheism could teach us something about God, and then of course also religious traditions. So how do you connect the idea? Do you connect, or do you still connect? And how then do you connect the idea of interreligious dialogue and with this aspect of theology, learning from what is foreign to us, making the tradition more instead of less, or at least having everything more or less in the sources and then just roll it out? I mean, just bring it in the world. This is the other way around. You connect something again to your tradition.
Yeah, I mean, it requires a theology that recognizes the possibility of truth outside of one's own tradition. Yeah. I don't know whether Schillebeeckx, he had such an incredibly generous mind, and he believed that, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm on thin ice here, but I think he did not emphasize the emphasis or the idea of the difference between other religions. He was confronted with the incredible richness of religious traditions, and he believed that there was no salvation outside of the world, and every religious tradition might have something new and beautiful to offer. I think we've come to a point where we're a little more critical or discerning on that level, that yes, in order for dialogue to be possible, you have to have a theology that recognizes the possible presence of truth in other religious traditions. But that doesn't mean that every other religion is equally true, or that you can learn anything from a particular other religious tradition. So there are different models for theology of religions, and I think in the Christian tradition, theologians have turned mostly to the Holy Spirit, to the pneumatological tradition as the basis for recognizing the possible presence of truth in other religious traditions. And if we believe indeed that the Holy Spirit is at work outside of the church in other religious traditions, it's not only possible but necessary for us to engage those other religious traditions and see whether there are elements of truth that we can learn from. So indeed, that kind of theology is absolutely necessary. I would say it's come about as a result of confrontation with the reality of globalization and religious plurality, but also partly in reaction to the atrocities of the Holocaust. So Vatican II and Nostra Aetate came about, partly in reaction to that. Of course, it has opened up many other doors, but it's also been a warning, to oneself of what can happen if we, judge other religions quite as harshly as we did, the Jewish tradition.
Which brings me, I think, to the last twist you brought in your paper, which I thought very interesting. That ultimately you say something like, well, we also know from the Christian tradition that Christ is the only true humble one. And then, of course, the whole thing changes again, in the sense that first we have to be humble to be open to other traditions, but at the same time, this humility is the core of our own tradition. I mean, this is... I like this idea very much, because that is only then you're away from the idea that, well, of course you have your own truth and your own tradition, but there is also something else, and then you have to dialogue with it. This makes it part of what theology is about. But could you say a little more on this idea? I mean, do you think that is in a way the core of the Christian tradition? That dialogue could be the core of something like that? Is that what you're driving at?
I don't know if I would say dialogue is the core of the religious tradition based on the humility of Christ. I think you can have a tradition that focuses on the humility of Christ and that as an example for our own humility without necessarily looking at other religious traditions for inspiration on that. So for most of Christian history, the humility of Christ has been the example for religious life without looking at other religious traditions. So I don't think that that itself is sufficient to necessarily learn from other religious traditions. What I find personally so precious about that belief in Christianity is, as I said, that it also keeps us eternally humble, that there is nobody who can be humble like in the same way as Jesus was humble, and that prevents us from the risk of being proud of our humility or assuming a posture of divinity that I think is very risky, and that, to be honest, some other traditions have suffered from in the course of their history. So to me, that's one of the treasures of Christianity, that only Christ is humble. You can say that's a depressing thought, because then we can never ourselves reach that ultimate state of humility. But on the other hand, it also, I think, keeps us all humble and receptive to a kind of humility that comes from beyond and that we can experience momentarily, but that never allows us to become proud in that way.
So that's humility is some kind of a meta virtue. It's not something. It's only, you can never say I am so I'm so humble, so therefore I'm the best of the world. So again, which I would say this is the ultimate problem for your project of making humility cool again. But that's another debate.